So as I said, I wanted to do the Chesapeake Bay separately because it has some additional points we can make without rushing it into the other podcast. So here is the Chesapeake Bay, which we said is a drowned river valley, coastal plain estuary. And it is slightly stratified, which means there is some mixing, but there is a clear separation of the heavier ocean water coming in and the lighter fresh water going out. Lots of the flow happens at the top head, not at the mouth, but at the head of the bay. These terminologies you want to be comfortable with, by a river called Susquehanna, which comes from Pennsylvania, brings a lot of snowfall melt with it, which means spring flow tends to be maximum. But there are lots of other rivers and tidal estuaries like the Potomac, James, Rappahannock, and so on. Okay. So you can see here that you use your knowledge of Coriolis once again. The ocean flow that's going at the bottom is going to be affected by the Coriolis, so it's going to hug the east coast of the Chesapeake Bay as it goes up north, and the fresh water that's flowing out closer to the surface, mixed along the way, slightly stratified, is going to be pushed to its right, so it's hugging the west coast in general. Okay, generally it's a very shallow estuary. You can walk almost 90% of it if you're tall. Unlike me, I wouldn't go in the middle. Nonetheless, you can see that the big feature here is the so-called Anoxia. So this blue region here, all the way in the Potomac River, and this one is Patuxent River, and much of this main stem of the estuary is in blue because its waters are anoxic. Okay, so this region obviously has rain in this, mostly in the spring summer months, but the mountains from which a lot of the water comes, as I said, in the Susquehanna also is because of snow melt, which means there is a seasonal change in the amount of fresh water coming in. So winds change, salinity changes, temperature changes, mixing changes, dissolved oxygen changes. Okay, how do you create anoxic conditions? Here you can see if it is a slightly stratified or not so well mixed, that means the high oxygens that mix into the surface waters are not getting mixed into the bottom water. Even though it's a fairly shallow, you can see the depth here is down to 20, 25, 30 meters at its deepest, more than 30, almost 40, right? So if you don't mix, then that water gets stagnant. And if the surface water is getting oxygen, nutrients, and light, it's going to have photosynthesis, fish, and so on. And they die and they fall into the bottom. And there are aerobic bacteria, microbes, which are digesting, respiring all this food, and they're using up the oxygen. So you end up creating anoxic conditions. So water, life in the water requires a certain level of oxygen, typically more than 5 milliliters per liter is the unit. There are many ways to say it. I don't know if there is a scale being shown here. Not quite, but you can look it up. So if it falls below 5 milliliters per liter, it's called hypoxic, and if it falls below 2 milliliters per liter, then it's called anoxic. Nobody can live in anoxic. Remember what I said before. This place is famous for crabs, oysters. Blue crabs are very famous from the Chesapeake Bay. If the oxygen disappears suddenly, crabs cannot run very far, very fast, so they will die. So there is major kills of commercially important marine animals. Several $1 billion worth of fisheries like menhaden and other things happen here. Crabs, of course, is big business. People come all the way from Japan to eat crabs. Japanese love their seafood, and DC is a good historic place to visit. historic, relatively speaking, all the nice museums. So Chesapeake Bay is a place worth visiting as well, and crabs are something really one should taste if you are not a vegetarian, right? So those are the kind of issues. So Chesapeake Bay, in that sense, epitomizes the interaction between estuaries and human beings, especially because Washington, D.C. is sitting right here on the Potomac River. Lots of rich people live here. The entire coastlines, if you add up, that's almost 17,000 kilometers in the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, it's such a small bay with a couple of 100 miles long, but so many coastlines are created by these rivers and tributaries that it's over 17,000 kilometers, I think, maybe miles, but anyway, it's very long. Okay, so something to remember, that the human beings are getting closer and closer to the water, and they are not always aware of how many things they are perturbing in the estuary. We will see later on that these hypoxic anoxic conditions are also related to what comes with the river water. If you have lots of agriculture like you have on the watershed of the Chesapeake estuary, then a lot of nutrients come in. Those nutrients drive huge phytoplankton blooms, which cannot be eaten away by the zooplankton which graze on the phytoplankton. That phytoplankton sinks and can be eaten by the microbes and create hypoxia, anoxia. So we'll see that for the Mississippi Delta, I think, later on. Okay, so complicated cascading effects of human activities.